When it comes to studying and preaching, we all want to preach sermons that impact people to follow Jesus and to love him better. The problem is, how do we preach sermons that are actually practical enough for people to actually do what we're asking them to do? So today in Practical Church Planting, we're going to share with you 6 ways to preach more practical sermons.
Well, thanks for joining us again today on Practical Church Planting. My name is Brian Androsian, and with me is Dylan Dodson. And today we're going to give you 6 ways to preach more practical sermons.
Yes, practical sermons. I think I've shared recently I've been doing some preaching coaching, which has been really, really helpful.
Yep.
Also I've read 2 books. The second one was not nearly as good. Christ-centered preaching was really good. And so I've adopted some of that. It's by Brian Chappell. I'd highly recommend it if you're looking at some preaching books, whatever. Anyway, one of the things he talks about in the book, one of the things I've been talking about with my preaching coach is being more practical. Mm-hmm. And the book does a really good job, Christ-centered preaching as well, talking about this, that it's not just enough to tell people what to do or to tell people why they should do it, but you got to tell people how to do it to actually make it really practical. And as I was thinking about this, and as I think about some of the preachers that I really like to listen to, they do a really good job with this. Mm-hmm. It's like you hear the stuff and you have an action step. Now, you may or may not do it. Yeah. But if you give someone an action step, the likelihood of them doing it is a lot higher.
Grows, right.
Particularly if you can tie it into something your church is doing. So like this Sunday, for example, we do our quarterly prayer and fasting. And so when we're recording this Sundays we're doing it in July. And it works out really well, like the practical thing. Mm-hmm. We're talking about, what's the main point? Something like we can build God's kingdom or our kingdom, but not both, something like that. And so anyway, one of the practical things we're doing is prayer and fasting. We've got a list, and it's going to work really well. And so people might not do it, but at least it was connected. Yep. And so, again, I even have on my whiteboard here that you can't see, but it's over there to my left.
It's right next to the pretzels.
I have how. Yeah, it's next to the pretzels. I have how in capital letters. And to remind me when I'm doing sermon prep, it's not just to explain what the text says and what to do and why to do it, but like give some really practical examples so that people will know what to do. Yep. And in Christ-centered preaching, he talks about, too, that you don't have to give an example for every specific scenario, but if you at least give a few scenarios, people will begin to see how it could apply to their life. So, for example, you don't just say, let's say you're preaching on the greatest commandment, love God and love people. If we tell you what to do, you need to go love God and love people this week. And I've been really guilty of this a lot. It's like,
me too. Yeah.
That's what it says, but it's like, that's great. But how do I actually do it? Mm-hmm. And if the hearers have to do the work that the sermon's supposed to do, then they're going to miss it. Yeah. And so you might not hit every specific example, but you could talk about texting one person this week how you can pray for them and then pray for them. Or it could be find one way to be generous to somebody this week, or ask one person for forgiveness as you've hurt, or something like that. I mean, there's lots of other things you do, but giving specific examples of how, and those are still kind of general. I mean, if I was preaching a sermon, I could probably think of more like practical ones, but giving somebody, how to do it and not just walk away. That was nice. And then who knows if I'll do anything with it. So that's a lot, but
yeah, I think it's really easy. I mean, we'll get into it, but I think it's really easy, especially, obviously if you're preaching, I assume you've been in kind of church for a long time, but to use these kind of just like theoretical ideas and present them, and most people I think would accept them just fine, because of course we're supposed to love people, or of course we're supposed to, honor God, or, these things that are kind of more of concepts than actions. But to actually, I think it's hard to, or it's easy to know if you're doing the opposite of them. Like I know if I'm not loving somebody, but am I loving somebody? That's a little harder to tell. Yep. So giving people kind of actionable things, I think is really helpful. But we'll get into how to do all that here momentarily.
So, all that to say, you preface that in, think about when you're writing a sermon, how are they going to do this? Mm-hmm. And we're going to give you some tips on how to give some practical things.
Exactly.
One last sidebar real quick. Someone who does this really well, who I've been listening to a lot lately, is Josh Howerton. He leads Lake Point Church in Texas. But, listen to their sermon podcast, listen to some of his podcasts. He does a masterful job of explaining the text, but then like, here's what we're going to do. Yeah. And so if you want a practical example, that's one. So here we go. How to make it more practical. Here's the first thing you could do. Give a simple and specific way to pray this week. So, you can have your sermon, whatever. Here's what God's wanting us to do. The how could be a prayer. Mm-hmm. For example, we did this a couple weeks ago. I don't remember exactly what the text was, somewhere in Mark, that's where we are. But it was like, God, would you show me someone to love how you love this week and give me the courage to actually do it? Something like that. It might have had it a little bit tighter than that, but it was basically pray this every morning. Simple prayer, take you 10 seconds. God, would you show someone to love this week how you help me love someone the way you love them, and then give me the courage to actually do it if it's something that might make me feel uncomfortable or it would be easier to avoid.
Yeah.
Now, did everyone do it? No. Did some people do it? Probably.
Yeah.
And if I had not given a practical step, would anyone have thought of that to do? No.
Yeah.
Now, they might have maybe thought in their own mind, here's how I could do it, but they're less likely to do it. And so a simple, specific way to pray, or if you're talking about the Holy Spirit, I got this from, this is a great example. For example, Josh Howerton, when they did a series on spiritual gifts or the Holy Spirit or whatever, and one of the weeks he simply said, you pray this prayer. If there's there's more, I want it.
Mm-hmm.
Just pray this prayer every day, talking about the Spirit. God, if there's more for me, I want it. And I was like, wow, that's like a super simple prayer.
Yeah.
And so it could be in the form of a prayer. If you're encouraging people to do something, I mean, it could be, we'll talk about this in a second, like something to do, or it could just be asking God to help you do it. Yeah. And you're more likely to pray that prayer, more likely maybe to put in action. But a simple and specific way to pray this week is one way to do it. Not just, yeah, that's how I do it. So you're gonna say something. I was going to say something, and I was like, no, that doesn't sound right. So
okay, fair enough. I think starting, or not necessarily starting, but I like that we're starting with how to pray about the specific thing, because you can. I think it's easy to give someone something to do, but it's hard. It's in some cases it's hard for people to do it, and so they may come away knowing, like, even if you give them something really practical, I need to reach out to this person who's the relationship has fallen apart, something along those lines. It's real easy to know that's what I'm supposed to do. It is real hard to do that, especially if things are really difficult there. And so instead of just saying, hey, you need to go do this, and then if I don't, I'm feeling guilt and I'm feeling like, I failed the assignment, so to speak, for this week. But no, go and pray for the opportunity to do it, or pray for the courage to do so. And in that case, I don't know, it sounds weird to say, like, then you're bringing God into it, which obviously, hopefully God's in the entire thing. But like, that's what most of us need, is the courage or the strength to do something, not just we're sitting there just having no idea what to do with this. Yep. Like, I don't think most people are walking away from a sermon just being like, that was great, but I have no idea what to do with my life now. But I think people, whether it's the right thing or whether it's the most ideal thing, maybe not, but like, I think people kind of have a general idea of what needs to be done in their life, but it's hard to do some of the things that we need to do. I mean, myself included. And so in helping people kind of facilitate or help guide them of how to pray for the courage or strength or whatever it is to do these things, I think is a really good starting point. Now, I mean, we don't every single week say, like, right, this is your departing prayer and pray this each week. But for certain things, I think it's really good. And I also think it's good, which we did, and I can't remember, you can tell me, I can't remember the avenue in which we did this, but to do something during the week to remind people of what it is. And I can't remember if it was a post or in the email, or maybe you did a story or an email or something like that for that Holy Spirit one that you just said.
We did a Bible in a minute.
Maybe that was it. In some way, I remember seeing it come across during the week. But it's some sort of reminder. It's not like every week we have like a post saying, like, this is the prayer for the week. Yeah. But in some way, whether it's like if you do a newsletter or even just like your own personal, Facebook or Instagram or something like that, just something from there, just some way to remind people of, like, hey, this is what we talked about. Just because obviously a prayer is more than like a succinct point sometimes, and so just kind of a reminder of telling people, hey, this is how you can be praying for what we talked about this week.
Yeah, and I think too, it's very attainable. That's like you could hear that and like, oh, I can pray that. Yeah. Or maybe you're preaching a sermon on holiness and, I don't know, fleeing from sin or whatever. You could say, pray this every morning, once a day. God, help me desire you more, or help me love you more, or help me. Yeah, give me a heart after you. I mean, say it better than that, but like, God, help me love you more. Yeah. That's a great prayer to help you with holiness. And so, it's not necessarily like your last point or whatever. It's just like a practical way to do what you've said, because you could have explained a lot of great things, but if people are like, but what am I supposed to do? That could be really hard. And so a simple and a specific way to pray, I think that's really helpful. And I think it's really powerful, because again, it's like, oh, I can absolutely do that. Yeah. So that's absolutely one way to make your sermon more practical.
There you go.
Number 2, give a simple and specific action item to do this week. Now, I wouldn't say you don't need to do all of these. You don't need to have a prayer and an action item and a thing. I wouldn't recommend that, because that's just one thing is the ideal. And so you could give them a simple, specific action item. So, for example, again, this is 5 days of prayer and fasting. And so, again, it's, do the sermon, talk about, I forget all the stuff. But basically, you can spread God's kingdom or your kingdom, or not both, something like that. One of the best ways to ensure you're pursuing Jesus and God and honoring Him is to pray and to fast and to actually do it. And so for us, we have these prayer cards, and there's like different ways to fast. We encourage a dietary fast, maybe we fast a couple days, maybe skip a meal or a couple hours during the day, or a food group, whatever it is. And we have on the other side of the card, we give them 5 things to pray for, so they don't have to like sit and think like, what do I do? You could pray for the list in 2 minutes, but just do it once a day for 5 days, or do the prayers twice a day. Super easy, everyone can do it, and it's just a very practical. If you do this, you're more likely to make this happen.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of. If you did a thing on prayer, and maybe I'm kind of reusing this example, but you could say, hey, text or ask one person this week how you can pray for them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's a very specific, simple, doable thing that you can actually do with minimal effort if you actually wanted to do it and see what would happen. And so give a simple and specific action item that most people could do this week. Maybe they have to tweak it or whatever. But again, it's not just, okay, go love God this week. Well, how do I actually do that? Mm-hmm. And so that's another thing you can try.
Yeah, I think early on, I'll be honest, sometimes it's easy to like fall back into it, but I think early on in preaching, it was easy to get into. If people said it was a good sermon, then good, then my job, then I did my job or whatever, and hopefully they were sincere about it. But like it was more so like if someone comes away thinking like this was, they got the information that they needed, hopefully they can glean something from it. But if it seemed good, then it was good. But I remember especially early on, like there wasn't, in my own preaching I'm talking about, there wasn't many like do this thing. It was more just like, okay, I got the information. Maybe I got some like application type things, but there was not like a specific thing to do from there. And once we kind of started talking about these things and implementing it more, hopefully people are actually taking those things. But I can at least have, I don't know, I can sleep a little better at night or have a little bit clearer of a conscience, knowing that if someone were to listen and come away, not that anything I said was great, but that they could do something that would help them grow a little bit closer to Christ. Right. Whether that was, with like a relationship or between them and God himself or whatever it is. But it's clear that if you listen to this and do something, then there's some action step in there that'll help you grow in your relationship with Jesus. And once I kind of realized that was something to kind of implement, it actually made sermon prep a lot less stressful because it wasn't like, obviously I still want it to be good, but it's not like it needs to be this really great whole thing. Is there something that someone can do after listening to this that helps them grow closer to Jesus? And it could be something as simple as, like you're saying, like text this person this week or something. It doesn't need to be this like huge revolutionary thing. And hopefully next week they'll come back and there's something else they can do to grow. I mean, this is a lifelong journey. And so once for me at least, once I kind of got my head around of like, just if someone can walk away with knowing there's one thing I can do this week that'll help me grow a little bit closer to Jesus, then in my mind, that's a job well done. And it really helped make sermon prep a lot less stressful, and it makes the whole process a lot more enjoyable to me.
Yeah. So simple and specific. So again, if you're preaching on fasting, for example, and you said we're going to fast a quarterly prayer and fasting, I want you to fast for 3 days. That is not simple. There's people who don't fast, and so you got to give people options. I mean, the stuff is fine, but you're not going to start that way, and so people can do more. But a simple and specific action item. So if you're preaching this week or you preach regularly, you're preaching again sometime soon, just think like one of these 2 things. Is there a simple prayer I could give people to give to do, or is there a simple action that all of us could do regardless of Bible knowledge and anything like that? Yeah. That's a way to make it really practical. Yep. Number 3, you can do this. Give some practical examples on how to do what you're asking people to do. So this one's a little bit different. We're not saying give everybody one specific thing. And so you could be talking about whatever, and it doesn't have to be the end of the service either, or the sermon either, or whatever. But if you're talking about loving people the way God loves us, again, in the past, I might be like, this is what he's wanting us to do, which is great. But the question is, how do I do this? And most people will forget about it or won't think through. Like, they're not going to sit there and think, I wonder how I should do this. They're just thinking, that's a great idea. And so using specific examples, this is where you're not going to hit every single option, but you hit a few so that people can see how this would practically look like. So you might say, this means not gossiping about the coworker that nobody likes this week. What would it look like for you to refrain from those conversations? What would it look like for you to extend forgiveness to someone who you've been really bitter towards and maybe didn't even know that you were angry with? Like that's how you could love them. I forget what example I'm using. We're talking about loving people or loving God.
Yep.
Did I say
loving people?
Yeah, loving people.
Well, I think you said loving God, but
okay, let's say we're talking about loving people. You could be like, you have a coworker who has who no one likes to hang out with. Like, could you eat lunch with them just once this week? And again, if I had more time, I could think of more details. But if you give somebody like what to do, like you have a point that's like, here's what it's telling us to do, giving a few quick examples of how to actually do it. Again, not telling that you're telling people to do this, but you're saying like people can begin to think, oh, I see how this actually works. And it's not this theoretical, philosophical thing that sounds really good, but doesn't actually, you know how it works. And so you don't do this with every point. You don't have to do this at the end of the sermon, although you can. But if you tell someone what to do, give them a couple of practical, quick ways of how this actually plays out so that it has some handles and doesn't just sound really good.
And one benefit to doing this is if you do sermon-based small groups, which we do, pretty generally, if we have something kind of along these lines, there'll be some question in that week's community group guide of something about it. Like just on a basic example, we're talking about like how to love God better. Then a question might be, how can you do that in your life? Something along those lines. And if you give examples to people on Sunday, then it's much easier to have those conversations during the week. And obviously, we want people to do these things, not simply just reiterate them in community group. But it can help reinforce it if they've actually heard some real life examples that then they can hear again during the week in their group and hopefully actually live out from there. But if you don't give any examples, then it's very easy to just give the kind of more theoretical concepts, like how can I grow closer to Jesus? I can read my Bible more. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But are you actually doing it? But if you're giving examples of this, reading your Bible is practical. So maybe that wasn't a good example.
No, I was like, even as you're saying that, that's not helpful. Read my Bible more.
Well, that's
what
true.
Does that mean?
What's more mean? Yeah,
you could say read one chapter a day on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
Yeah,
like that's like, oh, that's attainable now.
Yeah,
but anyway,
but it can help you, and even to people that weren't there on Sunday, it can help the community group leaders and the people there to like. Now here's some practical examples we can do. Now, not necessarily here's a list, which one are you going to do, but how are you actually going to do this? And I think it helps people actually think about it in their own lives and give an answer to that, and hopefully actually live it out if they've heard real life examples rather than just hearing this kind of concept and then trying to come up with examples on their own.
Yeah. Again, so maybe I'm trying to think of another specific example. Let's say you're talking about, I don't know, financial generosity. And Jesus is inviting us to be generous, like he's been generous to us. What does this actually look like? Well, you could have a budget line item where you say X amount of dollars a month. We know it's going to go to give towards something, but we don't know what. So like, and I'm not talking about the church. I'm just saying like, if there's any needs, charity, or a friend that come up, we know every month we're going to budget a couple of bucks or whatever it looks like for you, $20, $100, $80. Your income could look different, and it's just in the budget. So when something comes up, we're not wondering, hey, can we help it?
Yeah,
that's a great way to do it. Another way to do it is, I guess I was blanking on all my examples. How to be financially generous. So to be proactive about it. Like I think I mentioned this too, like when it talks about seeing people in need, like a lot of us don't have cash anymore. So I used an example recently about how my wife Christina makes these homeless bags and she puts them in her car, like one at a time. She leaves them at home, but she has one in her car all the time. So when she sees somebody on the street who's asking for something, it's got like food, and depending on if it's summer or winter, it might have some socks or some gloves and some water, or whatever. So instead of like, oh man, I wish I could have been generous towards them, I've done something to prepare ahead of time. And so that's another way to be generous, is to prepare ahead of time. And so again, you could give more of that, but try to think really specifically, how can I be generous with others the way Jesus has been generous with me? Yeah. So they can be like, oh, I see what this looks like. Other than that, just sounds like a really good idea, but I don't really know how to do it.
Yep. So. And some of these, it's like, yes, in reality, anyone could come up with these ideas on their own. Like none of the examples we ever give are like, oh, I would have never thought of that before. But it's just, I mean, there's a lot that's usually kind of unloaded in a sermon, and you cannot expect someone to like remember everything you said. This is the 30 minutes of talking. And so hopefully they do. And even if you forget to do this, hopefully they can come up with something on their own. But the point is to make it as simple as possible for someone to kind of follow what you're teaching and, and to follow Christ. And so if you can give them actually simple and actionable things to do, I think it's much more likely they're going to come away actually doing the things that you're teaching.
Yep. So give some practical examples on how to do what you're asking people to do.
Yep.
Number 4, explain things like your friend has never been to church is there. So we've talked about this for a lot of things when it comes to preaching and things making sense or whatever. We're all about being deep and explaining theological terms, all those sort of things. Just explain them and talk about them.
Yep.
And again, being practical, it's really helpful to consider my friend who doesn't know Jesus that I've been praying for a long time were to show up at church on Sunday. What would I say? Or what would I want him or her to hear so they could actually do this? And this is where it gets really helpful. And so this also makes it more practical. So again, if you have someone who's interested in Jesus and they come to church and they hear you say, let's love God, but whatever, love God, whatever, whatever. It's like, you know, if a friend who has no idea about what any of this stuff means, they would be totally confused. It's like, well, okay, but I came here so that you could tell me how to do these things, and I don't. Loving God sounds good, but how do I actually do it? And so again, it's just always for a number of reasons, but again, even practically, preaching like somebody is there who doesn't have any idea how this stuff works will just naturally make you think through how would I explain or say these things in a way that they may or may not do it, but they can see how it's actually done. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's helpful to have a specific person in mind. And what I mean by that is, so for me, from pretty much from the relatively beginning, I have a buddy of mine who ended up, like, coincidentally, we're from Michigan, also moving down here, but a few hours away from here. So we don't really keep in touch a whole lot anymore. But he he grew up kind of like non-practicing Catholic and known him forever, and he's someone who, if somehow they made the drive and walked through these doors, and I saw him on a Sunday morning, and I've literally, like, thought about this as getting up there, I would change a lot, like, and because like I care if he not that, like, I I don't know, like, I care that he knows what we're talking about, because he's someone who I've known forever, and I kind of know his thought process, or I kind of know the way he thinks about things, and I know that church isn't something he's going to regularly consider. And even like growing up, it's not something that he was really that interested in, and that never really changed. And so I know, like, if he's walking through these doors, not to like make a savior complex of like this is our one shot, but also like I wouldn't want to waste this. Like, I'd hate for him to come in and just feel like people were talking over him and didn't understand anything we were talking about. And so for me at least, take it or leave it, it's helpful to have someone like that in mind. Where on the flip side, I also have people I grew up with who are pretty staunch atheists, who are in kind of like a hateful way, so kind of, and I think that's a little less helpful, because the point isn't always just to defend the faith. And so if I had someone like that in mind, I could probably accidentally come off kind of argumentative in a sermon, which isn't very helpful. But so someone like that who's kind of in the middle ground, who doesn't really have much interest in church, but also isn't angry towards it, so to speak, I think is really helpful to have in mind. And it's not like you're gonna, every sermon it's like, okay, we're halfway through the book of Mark, we got to explain from the beginning, and this is who Jesus is. I mean, we do need to explain who Jesus is, but like from like a very basic level. But it's just explaining things in a way that someone who hasn't been there forever can understand. And it doesn't mean dragging everyone else down and just kind of getting bogged down in definitions. But if you just kind of explain it as if someone who's not a believer is there in very quick and succinct ways, not taking all day, I think it's going to help probably a lot more people than you're actually expecting in your
and it also helps people too think, if I invite somebody, they'll be able to track with what's going on. So again, not to make you feel pressure, a new person is going to be confused and not understand things. But they shouldn't be confused about everything. So there are certain, it's not like you have to explain every single, but there should be enough there where someone who doesn't know would feel like, oh, they know that they expect me not to know everything. And so again, not every single thing is going to make sense in a worship service to someone who has never been before, but some of it should. And so if you explain things like your friend who has never been to church is there, you will most assuredly become at least a little bit more practical, because some of these things that sound really good in theory, if someone doesn't know how to work them out in their own lives, then it's not going to be helpful for them.
And I also think it's helpful to take just a few seconds and explain why you're preaching on what you're preaching on, especially if it's especially if you're going like verse by verse through a book. And what I mean by is, we've gone through many books, and there's multiple passages where
there's
like
9 behind us if you're watching our YouTube channel.
This is our history. There's multiple passages where if we strictly preach topical, there would never be touched, and like weird stuff, obviously. And so if you're coming for the first time and weren't really familiar with that style of preaching, you might be like, why are you preaching on, I don't know, incest? Like why is this happening? And so just giving like a quick thing of, we're studying the entire book of Mark, or we're going verse by verse through this book. It doesn't take like a long explanation, but for someone who's not familiar with this, it'll help them. I think it'll just kind of help really quickly just remove that barrier of like, this is a weird thing to bring up. Why would this church talk about this kind of thing? So I think it's an easy and a good way to start.
So again, explain things like your friend who's never been to church is there. Number 5, I think this one is really crucial, and that is to assume that people want to take a step. Assume that people are there because they want to learn, they want to grow, they want to experience God in their life, they want to honor Him. I think it's really easy for pastors and people in ministry to not assume this, because you might have had conversations with difficult people during the week, or you might have seen that one or two people who are making really bad decisions or who have left the church, whatever, and then you can come across as somewhat combative from stage kind of condemning people for like not trying harder and not inviting people more, not sharing their faith more, and then it's just bad for everybody. If people, especially now, post COVID and all these sort of things, if they're coming to church, they want to be there for some reason.
Yeah.
They love Jesus, they're interested, they've had a hard week, and they just don't know what else to do. Like the cultural, I'm just going to go because everyone else goes. Like even like people who really love Jesus, going to church every Sunday is not even assumed anymore. Like really love Jesus, and that's fine. It's whatever. It's a podcast for another day about what to do about that and whatever, how to engage people. But I think if you come from the posture of most of the people here want to learn and want to grow, and then you'll think about these practical things because you know they want to do it, and you'll spend less time trying to convince them and just saying, here's how to do it. Because I'm telling you, I don't know, every church is different, and so you might have a lot of difficult people. But in my experience, and I know it's just my experience, very limited, but generally speaking, most people are there because they want to be there and they want to learn. Now, maybe they're not as generous or forgiving or loving or whatever as you might want them to be, but it's not that they don't care at all, or they wouldn't be there. Now, of course, some have alternate, but again, I think most people do. So I think if you assume people want to take a next step, then when you start to think of how can I make this more practical, it becomes a lot easier because then you move away from trying to convince them why. I mean, you should talk about why and just tell them how. And again, if someone doesn't know about Jesus, they have questions, they might not do it or anything like that. But it can feel winsome, it can feel interesting. It's like, oh, people want to do this, and I might want to do this. And so I don't have a lot of practical things other than I think that mindset can really help you if you're someone who is bitter or maybe you're going through a difficult ministry season. Just assuming most people want, even if like your church is declining and it's small right now and it's not what you want it to be, people are still there because I think many of them want to be to some degree. And so if you assume they want to take a step, you're much more likely to give them steps to take.
And I'm glad you said that because we're not saying have like a blind assumption or a false assumption just to make yourself feel better. But I think this is generally true for in most cases that, like you're saying, people want to be there. People are there for a reason. I get there are people who come maybe just to see other people and stuff, but we are in a day and age where it's not hard to do that outside of church if you wanted to. And honestly, like if someone, even if their main purpose of coming is to see, maybe see people and that's why they're coming, they're not closed off to hearing things. Otherwise they wouldn't be coming. And so I don't think this is like a blind assumption. I think in most cases there are people, and probably the majority of people, who want to take some sort of next step. Now, will they is a different story, or are they comfortable doing whatever next step is kind of, at their stage, maybe another conversation. But I think most people, at least in conversations I've had, most people want to grow closer to Jesus. If they are believers and coming to church, they want to, develop that relationship. It's just a matter of how and actually taking those steps. So I don't think this is a blind assumption. And one thing that I've kind of like from a practical standpoint that I've actually caught myself doing a couple times, I think it was either the last sermon or maybe the one before, I can't remember, but as we were talking through, we do a message collaboration every week, or sermon collab, whatever. We were going through mine, and I kind of caught this, and I was like, I think I've said this in maybe the last one or two sermons I've given, and I was like, I sound like a jerk because I don't remember what the point was or what it was, but it was something along the lines of like, our faith shouldn't just be like a Sunday morning at 9 a.m. for an hour and whatever not your community group is kind of thing, but should be every day, something along those lines. But the way I was saying it was like, I know this is what you all think. I know all you only care about, coming on Sundays and then don't care about your faith outside of that. And as I was writing it, I didn't think of that. And then as I was saying it out loud, I was like, I don't even believe this. Like, I don't even think this is true about most people I know. Of course it is some. And of course there's been times in my life where that's true. But like, why am I saying, I just sound like I'm spiteful towards the people that I actually like and that I'm not spiteful towards at all. And so I think it can be really easy to kind of get into that a little bit, especially, like you said, especially like depending on your frame of mind the day that you're actually writing something. And so I think it's good. I think that's one benefit of like writing things ahead of time. They can go back and read through it again and not let your emotions influence as much. But assuming, not like blindly assuming the best, but kind of assuming the best about people. Not that you're not going to tell them the truth or that you're going to ignore issues that don't need to be ignored. But assuming that people want to grow closer to Christ, I think will really help you actually help them along those lines.
Yeah, and so it's a step too. It's not a leap. It's not a jump. It's not something that's like only the quote unquote super Christians are going to do. Because I think sometimes we can get discouraged because we're asking too much. And if we're being honest, if we weren't working in ministry, we had another job, we had other things, we wouldn't do the things that we're asking people to do. Yeah. And so it needs to be something simple and attainable. People can go further. But it's got to start something where everybody can do, and then people can do other things if they want. And so I just think, assuming people want to take a step, I'll be preaching more practical sermons because then you're going to give them steps to take.
There you go.
So, and then last but not least, number 6, celebrate the effort not the result.
Yeah.
So, people could, going back to the prayer thing, or maybe going back to the specific action item, maybe somebody did pray it and nothing much happened, or they try the action item and it didn't really, didn't go out how they want. I think it's just a big deal to celebrate and encourage people that they took an effort, whatever God did with it, whatever is going to happen in the future, who knows, but to not make the end goal, if you did, how good a job you did be what you're celebrating.
Yeah.
So, hey, we encourage you to pray this every day this week. You prayed it 2 or 3 times. That's awesome. I think even talking about these during the sermon or with talking to people, it's like, hey, we asked to do this a couple weeks ago. I had this conversation with somebody. Here's how it worked out for them. And it might not have been the super amazing thing, but just celebrating, hey, look what happened. They took this step, they did this thing. 50,000 people didn't come to Jesus, but Jesus didn't ask us to convert 50,000 people
right.
to come to him. So, whatever. But I even think that's helpful with when you're preaching these practical things, is not to get so focused on, if you do this, make sure this happens and this is the result, and it's only really worth it if you get the result that you want. But this, that you tried and that you took a step, and I think that's all that God is asking us to do. And so celebrating when people do that, and of course, if there's a cool result, you could share that as well. But just celebrating the effort, I think, is really helpful.
And there's some things you give. There's not always going to be the most tangible result. If you tell someone, pray every day or whatever, pray this prayer. Obviously, hopefully the result is they prayed the prayer, but they may not feel, or they may not see a direct, benefit necessarily from it. And especially if someone's kind of newer in the faith, that could be discouraging if they're expecting if I do this, this will happen, which hopefully we're explaining things in a way that's not the case. That's not what we're implying, but obviously that can be what some people kind of come away with. And so talking about hey, this person did this, or this person did part of this, and isn't that great? I think it'll help people that did do part of it or didn't necessarily accomplish what we told them to accomplish, feel oh, okay, I did take I took a step, and maybe it was a baby step. Maybe it wasn't as big of a step, but I'm not a failure because I prayed 4 out of the 5 days, or I prayed 3 out of the 5 days, or I wanted to reach out to this person and I typed out the message and I chickened out. The point is to send it. The point is to do something with it. But you know what? I would rather someone actually think through what they're going to say than to just ignore it altogether. Yeah. I would rather someone start somewhere, and I think we would all say that. And so I think it helps people see that the point is to do something, but the first step of doing something is to start doing something, or to start somewhere. And it not necessarily doing things to the full extent of what we're saying doesn't make you a failure as a believer. It means that you're a person, and we all don't, we all fail sometimes. And so I think talking about not necessarily failure, but talking about that, taking that step that didn't necessarily accomplish what we talked about accomplishing, is really helpful. And I think that'll help you get more people kind of bought into these action steps down the road.
Yeah, so we're doing, like I said, this 5 days of prayer and fasting. Let's say someone decided to fast for lunch for all 5 days, and then they told me the next week, they're like, hey, Dylan, I did 2 days, and they're probably feeling bad about themselves, I wish I did more. Imagine me responding to them and be you fasted 2 days. Isn't that incredible? Isn't that awesome? When was the last time you fasted? Oh, I don't know. That's just a whole different feeling and vibe of what's going on, of celebrating you took a step. A lot of times people feel like they're a failure anyway, especially if they don't do it. And so to be celebrated and encouraged, I think, goes a long way. And so when you are practical with these things and you see people make efforts, even if they're not the full what you would hope, I think you celebrate that, encourage people, because they're trying, and that's what's the most important thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So celebrate the effort, not the result. So, hey, those were 6 ways to preach more practical sermons. I think that one of the best things that I'm learning, I think a lot of people can do, is take what and why and actually tell people how to do it and do the work for them, so they're not leaving thinking that was really helpful and they don't really know what the next step is.
Yep.
So, hey, if you want more information, we've got a couple of things. Practicalplanting.com. It's our website, a lot of free resources there. Our YouTube channel, you can watch us if you're listening to this on YouTube as well.
That's right.
And of course, our Facebook group. I think we're closing in on 1,800 people in that group. So if you just search Practical Church Planting on Facebook, join the group. A lot of people are asking questions and to help you out anyway. So that's it. Thanks for being with us, and we'll be with you next week on Practical Church Planting.